Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Collister. I'm an investigative reporter and a member of the Society of Professional Journalists. I head the SPJ Awards and Honors Committee and have been an SPJ member since I was in college. So it is a pleasure to have you join us here with the SPJ New England chapter and a discussion with the folks who operate the Media Matters organization. We're going to start with our guest, David Brock. He is the founder of Media Matters. And then we also have the president, Angelo Carusone. And David, I'd like to start with you. Can you fill us in on what is Media Matters and why did you start the organization?
Yes, thanks for having me on. Media Matters is a progressive media watchdog. We analyze and correct and critique a cross-section of mostly national, but some local media. We post content. Oh, I'm sorry. That's my dog. We post content on a website and through social media channels on a daily basis in rapid response form. Hey. Let me talk a little bit about why I started the group. I started it in 2004, we launched. I had written a book called The Republican Noise Machine in 2003. And the point of the book was to try to describe exactly the title and how it came about. And one of the things I discovered in my research was one of the very early things that the organized right did was to create media watchdog called then Accuracy in Media in 1969. And what I did was sort of trace the impact of that group. It was sort of the foundation of the Republican Noise Machine in a lot of ways, and came before the conservative think tank networks and conservative media and sort of set the foundation for that. And so I looked at the progressive landscape and decided that something executed in a very different way, but something akin to a media watchdog was necessary to correct what I considered to be an imbalance in the media. And, the landscape, and I'm sure Angelo will talk about that, has changed pretty dramatically since 2004. But in a way, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And so that imbalance, I think, is still largely in place. And by that, I mean a very powerful right-wing media network, flagship Fox News, and down from there. A mainstream media that is still under a lot of pressure from the organized right when news stories don't come out their way. We've observed a phenomenon where media is responsive to that criticism and can in a way bend over backwards to accommodate it, which creates skewed stories. And then avowedly progressive media, more powerful today than it was when I started out in 2004, but still small potatoes compared to what the conservatives have. And so what we were trying to do was, with the mainstream media, strengthen journalism, not weaken it in the way the right wing has done, through our monitoring and our criticism, and to push back against the misinformation in the right wing media, and to provide content to progressive media. And so that's kind of how the system works.
So let me ask you, for the sake of clarification and definition, what do you term as right wing, and what do you term as progressive? So can you sort of break that down for us?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, right wing. I would start with the Fox News channel, and I think the impact of the Fox News channel, if you look back more than I guess 25 years we're going on, is the thing that has, in my mind, changed our politics the most in terms of its reach and its power and its hold over the conservative base. And then, of course, There are a lot of conservative media properties. There are other networks, Newsmax and others on cable. There are very high traffic websites from Breitbart to Washington Free Beacon to Gateway Pundit, things like that. There are still the legacy conservative magazines like National Review, and there are a slew of conservative commentators, and you see those not only in right-wing media, but you do see some crossover into mainstream media as well. Progressive media, I would say again, you do have some significant online presence. You have those, just as the right does, the legacy magazines, The Nation, Mother Jones, things like that. I would consider at this point, although it's evolved over time, MSNBC is certainly a progressive network, and those primetime hosts sometimes in their reach can rival some of the right wing as well. So there's some more balance in the conversation as a result of that. So that's basically my definition. And then of course mainstream media is everything in between, and it's I imagine the folks on listening now, and from the New York Times on down to regional and local legitimate and credible news outlets.
So essentially it comes down to the politicization of news, which early on in my career and in my training, we were taught, like most journalists, that we were supposed to not be political. We weren't even supposed to be part of the story. We were just supposed to cover the facts. So this division that has created this right and left, even has obviously tainted what we call the mainstream. But Angelo, you're the president of Media Matters. And why don't you talk a little bit about what you do day to day, what you see are the hot button issues that you're zeroing in on right now? There seems to be so much of it. What are you concentrating on these days?
Yeah, I think that you answer, I mean, actually your question basically answers it in a way, which is that, there used to be, sort of the genesis that David was talking about. It gives some context for the founding, and it explains an important tactic that the right deployed, which is this: they built this engine that with misinformation was optimized to work the refs. And for a large part of our history, it was focused on mostly newsrooms. But one of the things that's really changed is that there used to be a pretty static and steady way in which information and misinformation flowed, sort of up a food chain. It was very predictable. There were patterns. What the difference maker now is that it's not as clean. The food chain is not as predictable and consistent. And so to your point, every day is almost like a different day. You're not actually relying on a tried and true predictable pathway where, historically, for example, if there was a new emerging piece of misinformation or narrative that the right wing was pushing through think tanks and through talkers, they would try to infect local news first, and then leverage that to try to get more national uplift for it. That meant that we could focus our efforts on saying, okay, let's inoculate or put our monitoring efforts on, say, a particular area where we know they're focused on, and that'll prevent it from spreading and saturating. Now they can leapfrog that. They can go on social media, they can use their massive reach to just leapfrog over the traditional food chain. So the first thing we do day to day is we try to identify, is there something percolating right now that is going to be a problem in a couple of days? That we can actually stop. And 10 years ago, it would have been getting newsrooms and reporters to understand that this was a smear or an attack that was being manufactured and driven with a concerted focus, so that they had some context for how to think about and cover the story, so that they weren't as susceptible to the right wing's efforts. Now it's varied. So, we could see, for example, a new video, and I'll use COVID as an instance because it's really clear and understandable. There were instances where we saw in the fever swamps, so in these, message board communities and other places that we monitor, where there was a new video that would have certainly gone viral about COVID on its way, say in 2 or 3 days, that because of what we already knew was in the video itself, we could go to the platforms and say, hey, this thing is coming down. These are all the ways in which it violates your terms of service. You should start to think about ensuring that your recommendation engine is not accidentally supercharging this. We know there's a coordinated effort to manipulate the algorithm to juice it. And then, or alternatively, the same thing we could do in newsrooms, which is that, a couple of years ago, we started more aggressively tracking QAnon candidates because we sort of saw this emergence of QAnon, which was a direct byproduct of this larger right-wing echo chamber. But there wasn't it seemed so fantastic, so ridiculous that most journalists were like, why would I write about this? This doesn't make any sense. And one of the things that we were doing, as early as 2019 was beginning to demonstrate the relationship between soon-to-be or current candidates that were running in primaries and their QAnon ties, which allowed us to inform and enrich both the political and local media reporting and the national media reporting around it, but it was to give some context for what was actually taking place on the ground. So day to day, what do? We monitor. We live monitor about 60,000 hours of television, radio, podcasts a year. And then we have this other engine that ingests a whole range of message boards and other sort of information channels that are not easily gettable through social listening tools. So we treat basically these, message board communities and other big chat rooms as if we treat a radio show or a podcast. And so we do the monitoring, and day to day, what we're trying to identify is what's coming around the bend that we can do something about before it fully metastasizes. And then the second question is, okay, something is moved, something is spread. The mainstream media or journalists are missing a story here. They're not giving context. There's 26 national stories over a 48-hour period about gas prices. 6% of them mentioned the historic profits of the oil and gas companies. Is that important context that should be included in stories? Is this a legitimate critique? Is there a way for us to improve coverage overall by pointing out that statistic? So that's the second way we think about it. So one is, can we identify a problem that's preventable or fixable before it materializes? And then the second threshold question that we deal with every morning is, okay, something is, there are some narratives, some imbalance, some issues here. Is there a way that we can improve the current conversation, based on data or some other research that we may have unique insight into?
So with the polarization on both sides, left and right, who's your audience?
I would say our primary,
obviously they're entrenched, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, look, our audience is journalists. I mean, there's a reason, and one of the things that's both a challenge and also an opportunity for us is that the right, as David pointed out, can spin up an operation that masquerades itself or identifies itself as a media watchdog, but they're an attack dog. They're not a watchdog. They are solely designed and focused on working the refs. They're not necessarily purely fact-oriented. Their data will be skewed for ideological reasons. That's not how we operate. So we start from first principles, which means if our audience is newsrooms or journalistic operations, the first thing we have to do is make sure that the underlying material we have is independently available and accessible, regardless of what our analysis is. So, if there are major national outlets that will say, okay, here's your message board data. We want to track what was happening there. We're going to write a story. Just share us the data, right? They don't need our insights. They just need information that only we have access to. So one is, to make sure that we are collecting and organizing the information in an accessible way. And that's everything. I mean, there are plenty of times where, we can hold a mirror up to especially television programs and say, look, you've done this number of segments about this topic. This is what the breakdown of your guests have been. There have been 0 experts on the subject matter. 70% of them have actually been explicitly partisan, and 10% have been left-leaning. So there's an imbalance. You should correct for this. You can actually look at that data in real time and say, "Ooh, we messed up. Our own narrative is off here." So instead of attacking them, we can actually give that research to them. So our audience is always the decision makers and the news makers, first and foremost.
I'm curious, what is the response when you weigh in with 70% of your guests or this, that, and journalists are like anybody else, right? They're going to get their dander up a little bit and be like, oh my gosh, but they should have the thought process to ingest it and make the correction. But what response do you typically get?
It's a mixed bag. I mean, I think it's the nature of the criticism. The things that are much more clear cut, they'll take it, and oftentimes we'll notice an adjustment without a massive course correction. I think that's the difference between, say, part of it is ideological, right? The other is just profession versus non-profession. You can be in the media but not be a journalist, and journalism is a profession. So it means you have some set of standards by which you operate under. And if you're getting inputs, in theory, you should adapt. And so if you're day to day missing the forest from the trees, and somebody can hold a mirror up to show that to you, oftentimes we'll notice a big change. And sometimes it takes years. Just to be clear, I'm not optimistic about it, but I'll use CBS for instance. I mean, we do a yearly report on climate coverage, for instance, on major segments, and say, like, here's how much of your programming you devoted to climate change. Here's what the actual breakdown of that climate coverage looked like. You included this many skeptics, it had this many experts, this is what we talked about. We've done that for years. We put out this data every year. We just last year, so this is for the first time, CBS News, because their data ended up showing that they had the best climate coverage by the numbers, started to tout it in their own marketing materials, because that meant that they were tracking it. So, wow, this is a good data point for us. We should point to this out. That matters because now, I would say to your question, other newsrooms, as we're in the middle of this, we're halfway through the year, have started to ask, hey, what's our number? Can you give us an updated number of where we're at? Just to keep tabs. Are we driving individual stories? No, but are we having a scorecard that allows them to say, oh, where are we in relation to others, and how are we doing compared to ourselves last year? I think is the exact thing that newsrooms should think about, because there's the day-to-day news, right? But then there's also the broader agenda setting power and the editorial decisions that newsrooms make. And if there's a piece of input that we can make that is not based on, this sort of trench warfare bunker kind of attack that they're getting from the outside, but it's just based on their own data, and they can improve their coverage as a result, that's a great thing. It's part of the carrot and stick approach that we take. So it's a mix, and I'd say the same thing applies to the platforms. There are plenty of times where they disagree with our assessment. They would, they don't disagree with our numbers, but they would say, but you're wrong. We don't have to include that context. So I would use, as I was mentioning before, we've said 26 articles, national news articles about gas prices over the past 2 days, and only a small percentage of them mentioned profits. Some of the news journalists that when we talked to said, yeah, so what? It wasn't newsworthy. It wasn't relevant to our article. The data you're giving is not relevant to our piece. It would have been extraneous information. A good editor would have cut it out. So we can have those fights. And so that's what I was saying. It's a mix. Some of them say, you got us and we need to fix it. And some of them say, you're wrong. Or your critique is not based in sound editorial standards. And that's something we can hash out publicly or not. But I think that we try to do it in good faith and based on, to some extent, not just purely our own perspective, but the actual reality and facts on the ground, because we have to wear a couple hats at the same time.
So David, let me get back to you. When you founded the organization, did you think there would be the degree of separation, polarization that we have today? Because, back in the day, and I hate to refer to my own experience, but I remember sitting in a newsroom in Austin, Texas, and somebody said they were going to go work for some new thing called the Fox News Channel. And I was like, what is that? I had no idea. And now here we are today, and these roles are obviously very defined at this point. Did you think we would get this far? And do you think that your organization is having a real impact in what it is you want to impact?
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't think there were the information bubbles when we started that are so prevalent now. Not as siloed. I think that the right-wing media has changed somewhat since our inception, in that it's more extreme and more fringe than when we started. I mean, there's a difference between Fox and its relationship with George W. Bush's administration and its relationship with Donald Trump. And part of that is the nature of Trump and the cult of Trump, but part of it is Fox. It would be like if you had a network in the 50s and 60s that was promoting McCarthyism and the John Birch Society in terms of what Fox does today. And then it obviously filters down. Fox is the leader, and as Angelo mentioned, across the social media, you see some of the same trends. On the progressive side, sure. I certainly know people who are in an MSNBC bubble, that's obviously their choice. But there's a distinction that's really important between the MSNBC bubble and the Fox bubble. In its story selection, MSNBC is definitely skewing progressive, but on the misinformation front, they're not putting out misinformation. Everybody will make a mistake now and again, but they'll correct them. They're not in the business of misinforming the public. What you've got on the right is a machine that's purposely, not mistakenly, as I said, people make mistakes, as part of the business model, systematically misinforming people. So it's apples and oranges. There is polarization, but it's not equivalent. It's not equal. So that's what I'd say about that. And then in terms of our impact, yeah, over the years I've seen tremendous impact. I think more than what I would have thought when we started out. Now, when we started out, Bill O'Reilly put us on the map by answering our critiques and our criticism, and that happened almost immediately. And what it did was elevate the group. It didn't deter us, and so we were on the map instantly. And over the years, I would say one of the things that's changed is that Fox no longer has the ability to dictate what CNN is doing and other mainstream broadcasts. You used to see a phenomenon. In fact, I co-wrote a book called The Fox Effect, which was all about how a story could start on Fox and it would bleed over because other networks are looking over their shoulder and seeing Fox's ratings and saying, well, maybe we need to cover that too. That's, largely abated. So they really are sort of stuck in their own echo chamber. And that's, I think, to a certain extent, if not a large extent, of the case we've been making about Fox for years, that Fox is not a news network, it's propaganda. And I think that has sunk in with the public. It's sunk in certainly with credible journalists not picking up. And we saw it, the first time I really saw it was with the pseudo Benghazi scandal that the right and Fox were spinning up. And just with a couple exceptions, the mainstream media treated it with appropriate skepticism. They covered it, but they also participated in the debunking of it. In mainstream media, I think we've played a role that's been constructive. I think that there was, at the beginning, there was a time when the mainstream media didn't hear from a progressive point of view. The right had a monopoly on having its views communicated into newsrooms. And we saw that with, the coverage of the war in Iraq and things of that nature back in 2003 and 2004. That's changed because now there is a strong progressive voice, Media Matters, and there are others out there, obviously, who are also registering concerns in the journalistic institutions. And the theory was back then, if you could balance out the criticism, that at the end of the day you'd have a better journalistic product. We've definitely influenced elite institutions where talk for a minute about this canard about liberal media bias that was invented by the right, and that you're certainly familiar with and probably sometimes get hit over the head with. You would think that a New York Times would be in the category of having a liberal bias, and yet, if you looked at their 2016 presidential coverage, you saw completely out of whack situation where Hillary and Hillary's so-called scandals and Hillary's emails were reported ad nauseum. The New York Times entered into an agreement with a, scurrilous right-wing writer who had a book out on the Clinton Foundation, and actually, in cooperation with that book, published some really inaccurate articles that we noted. And the editor in charge of that coverage, after Angelo mentioned carrot and stick, this was like the big stick approach, wanted to have a conversation with me and see what our beef was. And so, they didn't necessarily agree with everything we were saying, but we were heard. And I think to the extent there was the soft coverage of Trump in 2016, that certainly hardened in mainstream media once he took office. Part of that is there's a huge audience for anti-Trump content. But part of it was, I think, a recognition that the media, Morning Joe, et cetera, helped put Donald Trump on the map in a way that helped his public image, and the opposite was going on with Hillary.
So Angelo, when I get ready to interview anybody, I just do a little quick research, quick Google, and Wiki describes the organization as a politically left-leaning organization. How do you respond to that? I mean, do you all I hear the term progressive, which a lot of people would say is code for liberal, right? That's that's the left versus the right. And then you have the mainstream in the middle. Do you all consider yourselves to be on the left, and what does that mean to the organization in terms of its perspective?
I would say we're liberal. I don't think we hide that. I think it's important that we own that, and I think that it's a perspective that we come from. I think that in terms of what it means, a lot of it is the lens through which we analyze the coverage. So one is that there is a deep imbalance and an asymmetry in the landscape. The right is not only, and I think this is a real thing that broadly speaking, journalists don't deal with enough directly and head on, and it is a little bit of an uncomfortable thing to make the point to, which is that we live in an environment where the right has such a hold on the share of voice in the conversation, this massive echo chamber, talk radio, the massive online asymmetry, the resources and the infrastructure to pound away at newsrooms in every direction, both through straight manipulation, but also through direct misinformation, that in some ways, newsrooms journalists have internalized the critique and have skewed their coverage, even in terms of how they approach an issue. I mean, we saw this in every way, right? Even good newsrooms had a massive disproportionate change in the way they gave coverage immediately after Trump got into office, where most of the articles about Trump at the top papers had a pro-Trump Republican, a anti-Trump Republican, and occasionally a liberal voice. I mean, they were skewing even their own coverage because they didn't want to seem like they were biased. So yeah, we own the fact that our critique is that there's one is that the effect that this echo chamber has on the way that newsrooms do their job day to day. So we're trying to focus in on conservative misinformation and the results of this. And I think it's important that we own that. And so I think one is just the critique. Two, it's that it affects some of the issues that we think about, which is that, we're going to be more sensitive to the types of individuals that are quoted and cited. We're going to focus more on things like climate change, right, and science, because that's apparently a liberal thing now when it shouldn't be. And I think that so it's going to affect not just our lens and our framework, but also some of the subject matter that we focus on too. And And that also means that occasionally we're going to defend Democratic politicians or other elected officials from bad faith right-wing critiques, especially those that spill over into the media. And this is real. I mean, there was a point, part of the thing that drew me to Media Matters was there was this, when Obama first got into office, there was a series of right-wing hit jobs on officials in government at every level, one of which was this absolutely atrocious video about a mid-level Department of Agriculture official named Shirley Sherrod that was put out by Breitbart that was completely and totally just manipulated in every way. It's a heavily distorted video that was edited. They put it out. They basically made it seem like she was using her official position to attack white people. It was uncritically cited by journalists at every level for 24 hours. The administration responded in an abrupt and aggressive way by forcing her out of her position. And it was a hoax. The whole thing was a hoax. And that wasn't the only one. I mean, the right wing went after Kevin Jennings, who was one of the highest level gay officials at the time, saying that he was a member of the National Man-Boy Love Association and all kinds of other disgusting attacks that were totally baseless, that started to skew the coverage in a way that was uncritically at least saying, well, what's the controversy, right? We should report on the controversy. And I think, so what does it mean? It means that we are going to try to be, at least to some extent, sensitive to the effects of the echo chamber, and then also the day-to-day trench warfare type effects that may have on both policy and some of the people.
You mentioned earlier, you made a comment earlier that on the left, you don't see as a deliberate attempt within the business structure to misinform people. What do you find on the left?
That's good. I mean, David can answer it. What I find oftentimes is a lot of desperation. And that's not, and honestly, in the media environment, because what they don't have are a massive funding infrastructure so Daily Wire, for example, which is Ben Shapiro's publication, right? He's one of the biggest advertisers on Facebook, biggest advertiser. He's a publication, Daily Wire. Ben Shapiro is the single most influential voice on reproductive health in the country because of his platform, measured by reach and influence on a topic. When he talks about something, it has the greatest reach and influence and the most amplification. He spends as much money as a presidential campaign would, on Facebook ads in terms of reach. Not because he has massive revenue, although of course he can convert that to revenue, simply because he has an unlimited amount of money to distribute his content. It's not, he can say whatever he wants and then pay to distribute it. And so when I say desperation, that's not meant to be an insult. It's that what the right has are genuine structural advantages. The company that was funded, that Rush Limbaugh was a host on, that Sean Hannity is, that a whole bunch of others are, is $20 billion in debt. $20 billion in debt, but he still gets paid, $20 million a year to do his job, even though his show is not a loss at this point. Most of them are. That doesn't happen in most newsrooms, right? And it certainly doesn't happen in progressive media environments. So when I said desperation, what I think is a lot of fighting for crumbs, a lot of high valence, highly emotional social media content that is designed to capitalize on an algorithm for not just reach, but also a little bit of either advertising dollars or some donation revenue, which is how their model tends to apply. And a little bit of a push towards a more energized audience, even if it's smaller, that can capitalize on that. And that's not meant to be an insult, but I think what they really lack across the board is stability that gives them the ability then to focus more on the content and the production itself. There are outliers, obviously, and certainly some really high quality broadcasters that have built up a platform, whether it be YouTube or some of these other streams. But by and large, that is a big challenge here. And they're more sensitive to the shifts in, say, a Facebook algorithm, whereas newsrooms are always dealing with the effects of that, but they have other revenue streams and other ways to offset it, and they're bigger and more commercially capable of addressing it. A lot of times some of these progressive outlets can lose their entire resource allocations by one change in the way Facebook deals with an algorithm. And that's very significant. Whereas if you're Ben Shapiro, and I use him as an example, but there are others, they buy their way through it. Facebook makes a change, their reach goes down, they buy ads, they double their ad buy, which allows them then to have reach and saturation. And I do think big picture that is a really big difference that affects the content day to day. And I think it also is escalating and intensifying the polarization effects, because it's increasingly mobilizing a further and further fringe, because they're the ones that are going to be most engaged with the kinds of high valence content that's coming out.
David, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I agree with what Angelo said here. I think that the left-wing media is certainly under-resourced, but it's a different approach. I mean, I think the approach to journalism is a good faith approach. I mean, can you imagine if Mother Jones published a hoax like the Shirley Sherrod incident that Breitbart promoted? I mean, I think they'd be shut down. They'd be out of business. Their supporters would pull the plug. So I think there's a part of it is about intention. Now, left-wing media, obviously, as I said, it's not perfect. They're going to get things wrong, but they're not perpetrating hoaxes. So I think there's the difference there is not only the level of support, the reach, but the intention. And then I guess the other thing is that, to some extent, people always ask, how come there really isn't a liberal Fox News?
There was an attempt, wasn't there? There was.
What's the root of the lack of resources? Some of it is that the liberal market's already served. So in a way, what the old saying that, that NPR is the liberals' Tucker Carlson. Obviously they are totally apples and oranges there. And then during the Trump era, I do think that the mainstream media was serving up just by covering Trump, just by covering the train wreck accurately, was generating a lot of interest among liberal readers. So that's just a sort of a structural imbalance issue.
So we have a question in the chat. It's for Angelo. Angelo, and I'm reading the question. When you started at Media Matters in 2010, it was in response to Glenn Beck's work on Fox News. How does Beck's work then compare to Hannity or Tucker Carlson today? You want to answer that, Angelo?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that there are obviously, look, there are real differences between the two. Beck was no doubt insidious, and he was a reflection of a new model that the right was beginning, especially the right-wing media was moving in, which was much more conspiratorial and beginning to organize power on the fringes. It hadn't been fully scaled across the establishment Republicans yet, but part of the reason Beck was able to get tens of thousands of people to DC and why he shot to the top of Fox News. I mean, for a while, he was the top-rated host on Fox News, even at 5 o'clock. Was because he was doing something different. And the thing that he was doing different was actually organizing power on what would otherwise be considered the fringes. And specifically, he was plucking from conspiratorial sites a lot of things directly from Alex Jones's programming, to be honest. Things like Obama building concentration camps, or he ran a whole bunch of stories about how these chips inside the cars, which at that point, those OnStar devices in the GE cars, that they were giving, that not only were they listening to and sniffing out Republicans, but they had a plot to basically steer the cars into crashes when it came time, sort of like in Star Wars, that Obama was planning sort of this mass murder of all conservatives that they had been quietly listening to, and that they should all abandon General Electric cars as quickly as possible. It happened to coincide with them dropping him as a sponsor, so I'm not suggesting that the two were connected, but certainly felt that way. But that was a big part of what he was doing, was conspiratorial stuff. And my comparison is not intended to like diminish him, but or the risk, but a lot of what Beck was focused on, and there was clearly a lot of anti-Semitism, but it was fantastic storytelling. That's what he was doing. It was all fantasy, and it was a narrative. And there was obviously harms from it, but it was much more akin to like the Orson Welles War of the World radio broadcast that caused all that panic, sort of like these tweaks. And it was good production from a quality perspective, but it was storytelling. And it was basically an old school radio program that managed to make its way to television, and that's why it took off. And it was insidious. He was elevating individuals, but it's not to suggest that it was harmless, but it was important to be stopped. I don't think if there was an advertiser campaign that made it no longer commercially viable, I have no doubt that there would have been Alex Jones on Fox News, not that long after. It was just too successful. The difference between Beck and Tucker is that, and sort of the real risk there is that Beck, it's not that he didn't have a line, but the goal really was producing high quality, entertaining programming. And that means that there's a limit to how far you can go on some things because you have to just keep the grift going. So once you get too far down a rabbit hole, you shift stories, right? So you can never really get to the kind of direction that Tucker's going. Beck never really wanted to build political power, partisan political power. He wanted to build cultural influence and cultural reach. And that's why he did a lot of stuff that was totally disconnected from politics. Tucker Carlson is a straight up ethno-nationalist who does not believe that the future makes sense unless America looks much more homogenous. He has internalized this idea. He does not believe in a pluralistic society at all, and he thinks it's a danger. And he also sees a vulnerability in the Republican Party that allows for him to build political power. So the difference is not just in who they are, but also in the landscape. There was still Rush Limbaugh back in the day. This is the first election we're going through in a period where Rush Limbaugh's not around in 30 years. I mean, the guy was the titular head of the Republican Party, and I don't think it was purely a joke. He was ultimately the line to how far things could go. What Tucker represents is not just an ethno-nationalist perspective, and that's already been well documented, but he has an intention to build partisan political power. And that is a difference because he's much more purposeful and directed than Beck was. In that way. Beck wanted to reshape the narrative, to entertain, and to be a little bit of a goofball. And like to say, not to diminish it, there were actual threats and real risks and people that took up arms and shot up places because of Glenn Beck and owned it. But the real difference is that Glenn Beck wasn't driving us toward a race war. He was driving ratings for himself and selling gold and food insurance. And Tucker Carlson has a platform right now that is solely focused on steering America toward a violent race war. And that's honestly the difference. And it really is quite terrifying.
And I would assume if Tucker Carlson were to grace us with his presence, or one of his supporters would be here, they would say, you know what, you're a left-wing nut job. He's not doing anything of the sort.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I am a liberal. I'm certainly that, but I also have a pretty well substantiated documentation of Tucker Carlson's descent into white nationalism, and he did explicitly 400 segments, and the New York Times wrote about this too, where he was pulling direct content from actual white nationalist communities online and regurgitating them. We actually have his producers sitting in the online fever swamps of white genocide communities saying, "We are here listening to you. Come and give us your ideas." Like, this is not, I mean, he's a champion for that ideology. And now he would say he's not a racist. That's why I was very purposeful in saying ethno-nationalist. I'm trying to be respectful of Tucker's perspective there. He would say, I'm not a white nationalist. I just don't believe, I believe that like should be with like. And I believe that people that are not white or European make us dirtier and poorer, which is something he has repeatedly said, and may make us culturally weaker, which is what he argues on his program. And that to me is the risk, is that Tucker, it's the receipts are there. And, we went back in time when this was controversial, back in 2018, we were saying this about Tucker. In 2019, we thought that we didn't have, that was not a widely accepted perspective. And I think this gets back to what David was saying before too, about some of our influence. Some of it is that if we really feel like we have the receipts on something, we try to demonstrate it to pull everybody else along with us to say that. It was controversial to say Tucker Carlson was a white nationalist or an ethno-nationalist in 2018. That we would have been dismissed as just a left-wing group with an axe to grind. And then we went back and pulled all of this audio of him defending child brides and saying that Iraqis deserved what they got because they were primitive monkeys, and a whole range of other similarly racist things. And and our point there wasn't to just play a gotcha game, but was to demonstrate that there's a pretty long canon here of Tucker explicitly advocating these ideas. And now we're at the point where he's not just advocating on the show, but he is using his platform to then to build political power and organize and move the rest of the Republican Party along with him on these ideas. And that's where I think the difference really is that, you know, Glenn Beck's operationalization of this stuff began and ended with himself. It really was about Beck and buying money. Tucker Carlson didn't buy a massive private jet and re-outfit the whole thing with extremely expensive, beautiful fabric that you couldn't sit on. Glenn Beck did. You know, I mean, he bought a museum and jammed it into a bus and drove around because it was fun. He was buying relics, you know, from because he liked having all these relics around. Like, it was never about changing politics. It was about himself. And Tucker's end is about building political power and operationalizing it into something more specific and concrete, which is exactly how Kyle Rittenhouse became such a champion for the right wing. Tucker was the one that was out there front and center immediately after the shooting happened, not after the trial, saying this man is a hero and deserves to be applauded for what he did, not condemned, and attacked all the other conservative commentators that were beginning to skew a little bit like, well, maybe we shouldn't kill people unnecessarily. And it's not a coincidence that Kyle Rittenhouse was interviewed by Tucker immediately after his trial ended. They had had an established relationship for a year. And that's what I mean by Tucker really trying to operationalize his ideas beyond just his own personal pocket.
David, let me bounce back to you and ask you, I can't help but think, you know, we're talking about journalists, we're talking about newsrooms, we're talking about political pundits, you know, espousing opinions, and that has somehow turned into news. What about the audience? Isn't the audience the consumer, whether they're on the left or whether they're on the right? Haven't they created this, and this wouldn't exist unless they wanted it and consumed it and believed it? And my last follow-up to that is, what efforts do you make toward the audience and the consumer?
Sure, yeah. Well, yes. I think obviously if that Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes particularly sensed that there was a market that wasn't being served, and that there was nothing out there like Fox, and that there was, you know, however many percentage of harder core Republicans out there that they could capture. And that was a brilliant insight, and they did that. Now, you know, how much the audience is dictating the content to Fox versus Fox is preaching to the audience, I think it works both ways. I mean, we did see a pretty famous incident where after Fox made a correct call on the election, calling Arizona for Biden, we saw that Newsmax and One American News, the further right networks, tried to capitalize on a little space there where Fox had done something accurate that was contrary to Trump's interest. And they did see a little bit of a ratings bump there, and Fox panicked and then sort of embraced the big lie. And so it's a vicious circle in a way. Now, if I can just take a minute to go back and address this liberal label that we have, I think, you know, Angelo did that very well, but I just want to say that this was very intentional. When we launched, we were in a room with PR experts and all sorts of people trying to figure out how are we gonna label ourselves. And the consensus in the room was we were not going to say we're progressive or liberal, because that would hurt our credibility. And I felt very strongly the opposite, that if I was going to go on a TV program to talk about media matters, I wanted to say exactly what we were. I didn't want to get painted in a corner and try to pretend that we're something we're not. The way we are liberal is that, you know, we were trying to solve a particular problem, which was conservative dominance and conservative misinformation. we're not trying to solve all the problems in the world, and we're not trying to solve every problem in the media. That was the specific mission, and that's why we took on, we self-identified. Now, the other thing I will say is that what about that issue of credibility? The way we became a credible source of information, it took time, but the way we did it was through our own protocols of accuracy. And Angelo's referenced this a few times, but we cross every T, dot every I, and the research that we publish, the core of it, forget the analysis, but the core of the research you can take to the bank. That was part of the model, that we would do research that the media could take up, and if they want to redo it, fine, but they wouldn't have to redo it. They could trust us, and we could be a trusted source. And so, as I said, that took time, and the liberal label probably made it take longer, but we overcame it through our own integrity.
So we have another question in the chat. It says, and I'll let you field this, David. Do we need some kind of truth in media law, rule, or perhaps a movement to ensure that what we're hearing and reading is the truth?
Well, this question comes up occasionally, and it really goes back to the fairness doctrine back in the Reagan years, when they did away with the fairness doctrine, which was requiring, to some extent, both sides being presented in broadcast media. And when they did away with that, it opened a window for Rush Limbaugh and company to come on. I don't think we're going back to that kind of regulation. And then of course, cable never came under that type of regulation anyway, so it wouldn't really be an answer to Fox. There is an issue of that's very potent and current about regulation of the social media platforms, and I'm going to leave that to Angelo because that's above my pay grade. But he could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we try to, we don't, I totally think David's right about the larger policy landscape. And I would just add that even on the platforms, we're really careful what we suggest there. I mean, because we are part of, we're progressive and liberal, we actually are free speech champions. I mean, there's a reality here, which is that we don't think that restricting is going to solve it. But as it relates to the platforms, I mean, like I said, we're careful with what we recommend. We are pretty bullish on the idea that the algorithms, the recommendation engines, should be subject to almost the way that you would treat a product liability. And that deals with a lot of the concerns around Section 230 and sort of like I don't think the platforms need to be policing content in sort of the truth in media kind of way. I think there are ways to really mitigate and prevent the way that they create the most harms. And that is by scaling things, by actually using their algorithms to recommend content that would have otherwise been not connected. And just to put it in real world examples, this is America, we always have had ridiculous ideas. David referenced the John Birch Society before. The difference between then and now is not that we're fundamentally different, it's that you didn't have this superstructure on top of it, helping the John Birch Society find for free all of these new members, right? That's what the algorithms do. I mean, that's why you're able to get such incredible scale for things like QAnon. It gets supercharged by an algorithm and it can take off. And a lot of the bad actors really appreciate and understand that. And I think that if you are a platform that is solely relying on engagement as a metric or your traditional algorithms, and you're not incorporating in the product liability side of it, the way in which it can harm individuals, the way in which you could be actively building networks of extremists and connecting these dots, I do think that's distinct from, say, regulating individual content. And I think we are we're pretty aggressive about that. That would go a long way in reducing the volume of misinformation in the space if their recommendation engines were treated a little bit different.
David, we have another chat question. There's one specifically for you, and it says, David, before you founded Media Matters, you were a member of what you call the right-wing media. Can you tell us a bit about the work you did on the Clintons and when you realized that this was toxic? That's the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Yes, I was part of the problem that Media Matters was launched to solve. There's no question about that. And back in the starting in the mid '80s through the mid '90s, I was, I mean, Hillary Clinton termed it a vast right-wing conspiracy, and people kind of scoffed at that. But the reality is, a conspiracy is a wrongful scheme. And so on the Clinton front, I was definitely involved with a dedicated Arkansas project that was funded to dig up dirt on the Clintons. The editors of the magazine that I was working for, American Spectator, didn't have any regard for the truth of that information, and were publishing things not under my name, but I take responsibility for some of the things I did, but about the murder of Vincent Foster, or that Bill Clinton was running drugs through Mena Airport in Arkansas. And it just, at a certain point, I realized that that there was a train wreck coming between what I thought I was doing, which was journalism, but I also knew I was advancing an ideological point of view and a cause. And at some point, one of those had to give way to the other. And I found to be successful that you had to go with the ideological over the journalistic. And over time, I rejected that and became uncomfortable with it. And then there was one specific instance in the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill case where I wrote a book, an article in a book assailing Anita Hill's credibility and trying to protect Thomas's reputation. And once I published all that and became a trusted part of the team, over the years it developed that Clarence Thomas's closest friends told me, who were my sources back when I wrote the material, that they never believed him, that he was an avid consumer of raunchy pornography, which they had denied and told me the opposite, which was a key proof point for Anita Hill. And so, I ended up having to apologize to Anita Hill for what I did in that case. So, I feel that in the book Blinded by the Right, I came clean, and dedicated myself to trying to take whatever good there was in that experience and apply it in a better direction.
Angelo, last question, since we're running out of time. Where does Media Matters see us going in the very near future? What's on the horizon?
I think the two big things are going to be, three. One is this Rush Limbaugh void. That is a real thing that is happening right now. It is part of the reason there's these schisms, and that will continue. That means that there's a lot of reporting about Democratic infighting. It is nothing by comparison to what's actually happening on the right now that is being driven by the right-wing media. The second is the rise of Rumble as an alternative to YouTube, and the effect that that's going to have on just flooding the zone with all kinds of misinformation in videos. YouTube in the last 2 years has done a reasonable job by comparison of pulling that down, bringing that temperature down. It's going to be a whole new ball game in the future. And the third is going to be the rise of these increased groups for peer-to-peer communication. So the larger landscape is going to look a lot more like the way the current Latino information ecosystem does, which is heavily oriented on these peer-to-peer small groups, 10, 15, 50 people that are just in chat groups. And it's their information distribution is going to be much more like the way they casually chat. And it's going to create new threats and new problems for not just the misinformation, but also for the economics of news.
David and Angelo, thank you so much for sharing about Media Matters and what you're doing, and being willing to talk about both sides of these issues and addressing them with us. And we appreciate you letting our SPJ members hear you.
Well, thanks for your time. It was a great interview. Enjoyed it.
Thank you all very much.